Hi.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to a very special program that we have today. You know, part of what we try to do in our child and adolescent psychiatry grand rounds is not only cover the current academic highlights, but we also keep a close watch on the social and political events that affect children and the growth and development and parenting process. And just yesterday's San Francisco newspaper, many of you may have seen the article about the San Francisco Juvenile Hall, you know, because that's been undergoing a lot of political controversy and cost escalation in the last year. And the last two paragraphs of this article say Daniel Macallair, Executive Director of Center of Juvenile and Criminal Justice, and a member of the mayor's task force, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to introduce you to Daniel Macallair. He has a long history of juvenile justice activity and juvenile justice reform because his first major activity was in the juvenile justice reform in the state of Massachusetts in the 1980s, which was the very first state to reform their juvenile justice system after they were all formed in about the 1899 to 1910. And so after his sojourn in Massachusetts, he came to San Francisco, where he was the founder of the Center of Juvenile and Criminal Justice. And he's also called a practitioner in residence in the School of Public Affairs Civil Engagement at San Francisco State University. So it's a real pleasure to have him here in the heat of this controversy to give us some perspective. Daniel, thank you.
So thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here, distinguished group. I don't always get this opportunity. I teach at San Francisco State and, you know, undergraduates, so sometimes it's not as insightful sometimes as I'd like them to be, but we're educating the next generation of leaders. Anyways, thank you for having me here to speak on the issue of juvenile justice. And specifically, I'm going to narrow my focus today to the issue of institutionalization. Institutionalization essentially meaning the institutions that we place youth into to rehabilitate them. A practice that we've been engaged in since the 19th century. And pretty much with the same results. Now, I've been around I've been in the field for well over 30 years. When I started, I had a full head of hair. As you can see that the mileage has worn. But when I started, the same issues that I confronted then, we are confronting now. And in pretty much the same way, and a lot of the same arguments. And this has been going on long before I entered the field. And really the discussion always, when we start talking about juvenile justice reform, and it's important to remember that the juvenile justice system is relatively new. The juvenile court was established in 1899. And so in the annals of human history, having a separate legal system that distinguished children from adults is somewhat unique. The juvenile justice system was set up on the rationale that it was to rehabilitate kids. That's what it's about. It's not about punishing them. And initially, when the juvenile justice system was created, we had juvenile court judges and we had probation officers, but it was a very informal system. And it was intended to be that way because through informality, it was believed that judges would act in the child's best interests, kind of be that fatherly figure. Most of them were men at the time, be the fatherly figure and would impose conditions or interventions that would be in the child's best interest. the reality, and that was the rhetoric behind it. In understanding the juvenile justice system, it's absolutely critical that we separate rhetoric from reality, because they're two very different things. They were back in the 1800s when the foundation of the modern system first began, and it's also true today. And one of the things that we hear a lot today, and I've been hearing throughout my career, is that a lot of times the youth correction system, the state-run system that runs the youth correctional facilities, they use the language of treatment. They use the language of treatment, trauma-informed, continuum of care, variety of, they have trained staff to institute programs intended to address kids' needs. But even the best of intentions in correctional institutions are often overwhelmed by the daily realities of confinement in an institution. And often that gets lost to even folks who work in the system. It's the daily reality. It's more the sociology than it is the behavioral health. So I just want to kind of talk a little bit about that today, and I know we have a short period of time. So, institutionalization in the juvenile justice and the challenge of reform. If we go back to the 18th century, the debate over reform is ongoing. We first established what we call congregate youth institutions. This is a 17th century term. And where did the congregate institution originate? I always like to do the definition: institution designed for the efficient management of large numbers of people through rigid structure, strict regimentation, and harsh enforcement. And that has been the reality of institutionalization for youth. Facilities that were supposed to rehabilitate, but actually much more prison-like. And why is that? Because our concept of institutionalization in the juvenile justice system originated from the penitentiary system. In fact, we used to house youth in penitentiaries, in the early penitentiaries in the 19th century. And at one point, someone realized that's not such a good idea, putting an 8-year-old into an institution next to old, hardened adult criminals. So they went back and they thought about it, and the solution they came up with was to create a juvenile penitentiary where you could separate the kids from adults. And the idea behind the juvenile penitentiary was that by separating from adults, you can create a more enriched environment where you can focus on the needs of the youth and thus achieve the goal of rehabilitation. And so here are the various renditions, and we tried it. So the adult penitentiary, 1790 to the present, we have that. 1825 is really the beginning of the modern system. This is where the opening of the New York House of Refuge, the event that ushered in the modern system. It was the first youth correctional facility originally designed as a preventive institution where we would remove kids out from the street who were on the path to delinquency, maybe hadn't quite arrived there yet, but it would allow the state to take control of them in this very controlled environment, imbue them with proper behavior, respect for authority, while at the same time providing a modicum of education, and hopefully instill some work habits. And that was pretty much the goal of most institutions in the 19th century, and frankly continued into the 20th century. Unfortunately, what happened is very early on, the same issues that had been identified in the adult penitentiary started to manifest themselves in these new youth institutions. And the problems ones we're very familiar with. The older, more experienced youth exploiting the younger, less sophisticated types. the abuse that were inflicted on inmates by staff in order to maintain control, and control was always a major challenge. And very early on, these problems started to be recognized. And so what happens? Beginning after 1825, first of all, virtually every state at the time had to have a house of refuge. This kind of creates this movement. So there's this house of refuge movement that ushers in this era of the origins of the juvenile justice system. And so for about between 1825 and roughly 1850, roughly 20 houses of refuges were built around the country. Virtually every one, shortly after their opening, becomes the subject of controversy. And it usually didn't take long before word gets out that youth were not being well treated. They certainly weren't being rehabilitated. And questions started to be raised, and often what would happen is that if there was enough talk about the harsh conditions in the facility, it would trigger a grand jury investigation or some media expose, and you'd have articles appear in local papers. They would be grand jury reports, and they would come out and detail all the bad things that were happening: kids being shackled, kids being beaten, kids being whipped. They used to use whips back then, and everybody would be shocked and appalled at what was happening. And so this went on for a couple of decades until finally they decided there were calls for reform. And so we went to really our first stage of reform. And it's what I like to call reforming the old reforms. And that's where we go to the reform school era. And so the reform school era really kicks in about 1850. And the reform schools replaced the houses of refuge. But they replaced them only in name. Because at the time we had a social movement called the compulsory education and the public school, or originally common school and public school and compulsory education. So the institutions wanted to be identified as schools since they were supposedly helping youth. And so they adopted the name reform schools, training schools, and industrial schools. But they all had the same reality. They were congregate institutions. They were designed to house large numbers of kids in very strict and regimented structure and harsh enforcement of rules in order to maintain control. And so that was the reform. So that was the era of the reform school. And the reform schools continued right into the 20th century. In fact, here in California, we called our state youth correctional institutions. They're now called youth correctional institutions, but back then, California, we called them training schools, right up until 1996, and I actually remember when the change was made, and we call them youth correctional institutions now. And so that's the latest era. So this is kind of the evolution of institutionalization in the juvenile justice system. And I want to point out that each of these eras resulted from controversy from the previous era. If you go to any institution, and the reform school era obviously is the longest, if you go to any institution that's been around, and so there are some around that have been around since the 19th century. In fact, California, our President School of Industry, just closed in 2011. That was open in 1894, and Whittier was open in 1891. That closed in 2007. If you go back in the history of any of those institutions, what you will find is roughly every 10, 15, maybe 20 years, some major controversy erupts. Some major expose happens about conditions in the institutions. And it usually revolves around the treatment of kids, the horrific treatment of kids, and sexual assaults, beatings, whippings, locking up in dark cells, bread and water diets. I mean, many of the creative punishments that they developed in the adult penitentiaries also trickled down to the juvenile institutions. And so roughly at 10, 20 year intervals, there's a new controversy. And then what happens, and we go through this ritual, is when abuses in institutions are revealed, first of all, everybody's shocked and appalled, and particularly in correctional institutions because they're everything happens behind closed doors. So it's not until somebody pulls the curtain back that we start to see what's going on the inside. So what happens is usually the governor will assign a call for an investigation, they'll appoint a commission, they'll study it for a while, they'll come back with recommendations. And the recommendations usually are focus on a couple of things. One, and number one, always, is we need new and better institutions. I call it the nicer institution syndrome. And along with that, of course, then you need more teachers, you need more mental health services. That became more and more of an outcry in the beginning of the 1920s and continued down till today. But this is usually the pattern. So what happens is then the legislature may throw more money, they'll build some more institutions or new institutions, they'll add on, they'll renovate. And then what happens is 10 to 20 years later, the whole cycle repeats itself. Because what's happened is they haven't really reformed the system. They've actually preserved the system. The old system comes back. The same staff, the same culture, the same procedures, all that remains the same. And so consequently, things don't change. So we just go through these eras and these eras of a cycle of abuse to reform. And then the reforms usually involve the same thing. We're going through this now, I'm going to talk about it in a minute, but they usually involve the same solutions. And so the same solutions that our great-grandparents came up with back in the 1890s and the 1920s and the 1940s are the same ones we're talking about today. Now why institutions fail, but some of the just priorities of institutional management. First, maintaining order. This is not about treatment. When you've got 400 kids in an institution, and you maybe have one staff for every 30, maybe 40, maybe 60, sometimes it's been more, they're not doing therapy, folks. They're trying to survive in a very hostile environment. This is a correctional facility. It really amounts to a mini penitentiary. Even we might call it something different, the rhetoric will be different, but the reality will not be. So maintaining order is priority number one. Avoiding escapes. If you're a manager of a facility, historically you don't want to have a lot of escapes because that tends to upset some of the local neighbors and communities, and puts the heat on you, and it may cost you your job. So you want to avoid escapes. And by the way, this was often some of the most horrific abuses that were perpetrated on kids were usually because of escape attempts. Because they wanted to keep them within the institutions. In the early days, they didn't even have a fence around it. They used to have like at Preston, which was up in Ione, they used to have an armed guard on a horse with that rode around the perimeter. Anyways, but kids would be subject to really horrific treatment, trying to escape. Staying within your budget. Don't go out of your budget because the legislature doesn't like that. And always projecting a positive image. And if you take a tour of the State Division of Juvenile Justice today, and I've been doing it for 30 years, they do this well. As I said, they've mastered the art of treatment. It's only when you start talking to kids behind the scenes and you start talking to actually line staff a lot of times behind the scenes, do you get a sense of what the true reality is. So the cycle of abuse. So just kind of to. Why does it happen? How does it happen? And why does it keep repeating itself? And why is it that we haven't learned our lesson? But first of all, the cycle of abuse begins when somebody is forcibly removed from their home. Involuntarily confined. Kid resents being involuntarily confined. Adults resent being involuntarily confined. It doesn't matter who you are. And we learned this from the Stanford prison study 40 years ago. Kids don't like to be forcibly removed from their home, confined in a correctional institution with other youth who don't want to be there, and it creates a whole dynamic. So they resent their confinement. Staff, when you're the staff in a facility, your obligation is to maintain order. That is your first order of business. and it's maintaining order. So it always has its origins kind of in the same place. It's this, in a correctional facility, I think we all know the dynamic. It's a power dynamic. So if staff orders a kid to do something and the kid says, no, I'm not doing that, and the staff says, yes, you are, no, I'm not, and it just, and it escalates. Until finally, the staff person is put into a position where he or she feels that they have to take some type of forceful action. And for the kid, in order to save face among his peers, he's going to have to hold his ground. And so it just escalates from there. And this goes on, and this is kind of just the normal pattern, the normal day in these facilities. So the youth are, of course, going to resist rules because they resent being there. Staff impose punishments for rule violations. That picture to the right, by the way, that was one of our innovative solutions here in California. We invented here in California. Those were cages. Those were put in the classrooms where kids were brought in and placed inside of them. It was literally just from ceiling to floor, and it was just about the size of a desk. A subject of controversy, needless to say. So the youth rebel against their punishments. Staff resort to harsher punishment to force conformity. Youth become more rebellious and resentful towards authority. Staff resort to abusive practices in escalating struggle for control. This has been true since the doors of the New York House of Refuge opened in 1825. It's been a constant reality. I mean, this is just, and it starts very early on, and it escalates very quickly. So even when in those previous reform efforts, when we built new institutions, and we did it in the 1890s, we did it in the 1920s, we did it through the 1950s and the 1960s, always with the idea that if we simply build this institution better, the reality would change. And it never did. So institutions descend into a cycle of resentment, defiance, distrust, alienation, and cruelty. And make no mistake about it, the culture in the youth correctional facilities right now in California are like adult prisons. It's divided by gangs. It's racially, ethnically divided by gangs, and geographically, norteños, sureños. So you have a culture of violence within the institutions, and staff try to curtail the violence. They use everything from shackles. They've got actually something new. These little grenades that explode plastic pellets. We've got, of course, the standard pepper spray guns, bear spray, which you can, literally, that's what the kids call it. So these are the instruments of control, and within a so-called rehabilitative environment. I often like to point out that for the juvenile justice system to continue as it does, we have to do a lot of pretending. Because the law tells us says one thing, and the reality is different. And everybody most people in the system know. So, for example, if a judge is going to commit a youth to the state youth correctional system, and so a judge will get a recommendation from a probation officer typically. And usually the recommendation will say something he will benefit from the care and treatment and educational programs available at the Division of Juvenile Justice at the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. It's got it's kind of a standard sentence that appears in most probation reports. So it's called this materially benefited. So they have to show, the law says that the judges must demonstrate that the kid will be materially benefited. And so this becomes, as I said, if they're making a commitment to the State Division of Juvenile Justice, they'll add this kind of catch-all phrasing in order to meet the law's requirements, or at least rationalize the commitment and make it conform to what the law says. The reality is, as I said, is anything but, and most of the time they know it. It's most of the time when we're sentencing a kid to a youth correctional facility, it's to punish them, and that is, that's just the reality. So, the realities of life. This was a photograph. It was a historical photograph from sometime in the 1960s and 1970s. It hasn't changed too much. So, first of all, how do you achieve status within a correctional facility? It's through violence and aggression. And this is a carryover from the adult system, and it begins the moment the child arrives at the institution. The normal procedure when a youth arrives at an institution, they're taken to, actually, in California, they're first taken to a reception unit where they're given a battery of tests, by the way. Educational assessments, psychological assessments, social work assessments, and then they develop a very deep, very thick file on the kid. And this is originally that was intended to be the basis of their treatment. It is not, it never has been. You have 3 institutions within the system. And so designation to a particular institution is based on age and geography. If you're from the north, there's 2 institutions in Stockton, and there's one in Ventura. There used to be 11 institutions. Now we're down to 3. I'll talk about that in a minute. Youth aren't committing crimes like they used to. So it's actually to the credit of the youth, not adults. I'd like to point that out. So when a kid comes into the institution, the first thing that happens when they walk through the door, the first person that they're greeted by is not the social worker, the gang coordinator. When you come into an institution, in a California correctional institution, they're assuming either you're a gang member when you come in, and if you're not a gang member when you arrive, you likely will be. And so what happens is, when you walk through the door, your very first day, before you're assigned to your living unit, you're interviewed by the gang coordinator. The gang coordinator asks you a series of questions. Gang coordinator there's one in every institution. And based on your race, based on your ethnicity, and based on where you come from, they're going to make an assumption that, 1, you're already a gang member if you come from certain areas. And if you're not, then they may make an assumption that you will be when you enter the living units. Because the living units are divided by gangs. It divides racially and ethnically, and I said geographically. So you've got gangs like the Sureños from the south, out of LA, San Diego, Norteños from the north, you've got the Fresno Bulldogs, you've got the Crips and Bloods. You used to have what they call the Peckerwoods, which were the white kids from the Northern California. There's not enough of them there anymore. But this is the kind of the reality, and the state recognizes it. And so the gang coordinator will ask you a series of questions, and if you say no, I'm not a gang member, and based on your race and ethnicity, they'll make a judgment about which gang you're likely to join. 80% of the kids, they say, join gangs. This is the DJJ's own estimate. Are gang members. Either they come in as gang members or they become gang members when they're there. But once they're there, 80% of them are somehow affiliated with an institutional gang. And why do they do that? They do that for obvious reasons: solidarity and protection. And if you survive in to survive in an institution like this, you need someone covering your back. Within the first 4 to 8 hours, and I've interviewed hundreds of kids over the years, and it's always the same pattern. And you can go back decades. It's always the same pattern. First, as soon as that youth walks through that living unit, is escorted to the living unit, I always like to call, there's kind of this formal orientation and then the informal orientation. The formal orientation is conducted by the staff, like the gang coordinator. But the informal orientation is done by your peers, the other wards, as they call them, the other youth in the correctional facility. And when you walk into a living unit, if there's 35 or 50 or 60, sometimes as high as 80, they're wondering if you don't know anybody, they're immediately going to wonder who you are and where you're going to fit into the pecking order. And there's a hierarchy in that living unit. And so they're going to wonder where you're going to fit. And the kid's scared, but you don't want to if you're scared, you're going to be scared, but you're not going to show it. And you're going to get challenged, and somebody's going to come by, you're going to knock you, bump into you, stick their finger in your food at the dinner that night, bump against you in the shower, and you basically have three options. You can tell the guard, which everybody knows you don't do, because that's, as we all know, then you get labeled as a snitch. You can remain passive. And if you do that, well, okay, they may leave you alone, but they'll steal your stuff. You become a victim. Or you can fight. The best option is to fight. You got to fight. And that's how you demonstrate that you're willing to protect yourself. And that's what causes the other kids to kind of back off. And it also will determine whether or not you get invited to join one of the institutional gangs. And it's common knowledge that in order to survive, you want to be invited into one of the institutional gangs. And so that's the reality that youth face. That is an ongoing reality. It's in all the institutions, and it's been there for decades. And actually, in the staff, nobody really denies it. It's just a fact of life. But it's one that's often kind of skipped over when we talk about these places. So as I said, youth vie for status and dominance. Sophisticated streetwise wards victimize weaker and vulnerable wards. And we know this from the culture of prisons. It's the same in youth institutions. Youth seek protection and solidarity by joining gangs based on race, ethnicity, and geography. Youth understand that staff cannot protect them, and this is acknowledged by the staff themselves. That a lot of times, kids are told that if somebody challenges you, you've got to fight. You've got to be able to demonstrate. And sometimes they'll tell them that we'll let you, give you because they're supposed to discipline them if they do fight, and they do. And sometimes some kids will get a pass as early on, just to allow the kid, just to allow the kid the opportunity to establish themselves with the other kids in the unit in order to, avoid ongoing trouble. So these are kind of bargains that are sometimes made between the staff and wards, or just kind of a recognition of reality, and that's the sanctioning of fights is not unusual, and so I'm going to leave enough time for questions. So I want to. So we're in the midst of another era of reform. Governor Newsom, one of the first things he did out of the box when he was sworn in was to announce that he was going to take another stab at reforming the state's youth correction system. I mean, and to his credit, not too many governors put this on the front burner, and so that was certainly to his credit. Unfortunately, as we warned then, the approach that they were proposing was an approach that, frankly, we've taken throughout history. Moving the institutions to another taking the existing institutions, moving them onto another administrative body, with the promise of somehow that new administrative body is going to institute changes that we've never been able to achieve over a 100-year period. This is the second time we've done it, and just in the last, nearly 50, just a little more than 15 years, Governor Schwarzenegger did the same thing back in 2005. And that was the result of a lawsuit. And the lawsuit actually resulted in more money being poured into the system, where we spend about $300,000 a year right now per capita. So that was in 2015, and it's done. We've done it about 6 times since 1960. So in 1944, we created the California Youth Authority that was supposed to be the final answer to the creation of a rehabilitative institution. It was going to take us to a place that youth corrections had never been before since the opening of the New York House of Refuge in 1825. And at no time had any jurisdiction, any government ever attempted to create institutional reforms like California did, beginning in 1944 under Governor Warren, through the 1950s and in the 1960s, until into the 1960s they finally said, this is not working. But in the 1950s, we invested large amounts of money to create specialized institutions, inject more mental health services, the concept of therapeutic communities, but the specialized institutions for different types of offenders. We did that until the 1960s, when many of the people who advocated those changes, many of the leaders of what was then called the California Youth Authority, the ones who'd been the advocates for that, finally put up their hands and said, this is not working. And we need to come up with a new strategy. And unfortunately, the politics changed then. But nevertheless, the institutions have remained, and they've remained throughout the 20th century into the 21st century, and they remain with the same realities. So why is that? First of all, problem youth are hoarded together in a subculture where violence and aggression is prized. We know this one. It is a culture of violence, and who is at the top? It's the older, it's the sophisticated, it's the tough, streetwise kid that knows how to handle himself, and that's how you achieve status in this case in the youth correctional facility in California, and frankly, every other place in the country. Institutions are impersonal. They don't provide individualized attention. I mean, that is what allows kids to grow. The attention they get from adults, the positive interactions, and frankly, the positive interactions that they get from their peers in their teenage years, if we provide them the right environment. This is not the environment for that, and we have no capacity to do that. There is no capacity for that. This is a place where violence is prized. Custodial control always supersedes therapeutic needs. I've never seen a correctional facility where, frankly, you often have what we call silos. So you have your mental health folks over here, you've got your educational staff over here, and you've got your custodial staff over here, you got your administrative staff over there, and they're trying to tell everybody else what the administrative staff's trying to dictate what goes on. But the people that control the inside of the institution are the custodial staff, they're the guards, because they're dealing with the kids on a daily basis, and it's really it's their reality, and that's a different reality, and it puts them in conflict with some of the other more professionalized services, and so there's always that division, and a lot of times the custodial staff look down on the therapeutic staff, the mental health staff, or the educational staff looks down on the custodial staff, and so you always have that dynamic going, and then the administration is left to kind of issue decrees to hopefully it'll improve, but the fact is that these kind of run themselves with staff who have been there for a long time. They can't provide a safe and secure environment, and I assume that we're all in agreement that for treatment to happen, for effective treatment to happen, the kid's got to feel safe. You don't put somebody in an environment where every day every moment of the day, they're looking over their shoulder to see who's, whether their kid sitting next to them is an enemy, a potential friend, a gang rival. Am I going to have to fight before I get out of this door? That's not an environment that's conducive to rehabilitation. It's certainly not an environment conducive to somebody looking towards a positive future. They're looking to survive, and that's the environment that we place them in. Institutional isolation does not address circumstances of the home and the community. I mean, most of the kids who ended up in the juvenile justice system, I always tell my students, they're the children of the poor. I mean, it's always been that way. And of course, they're the racial and ethnic issues now, mostly black and Latino kids now. But the fact is that it is a place that we put people temporarily, and not really to fix them. Because the work has to be done back home, back in the community, with the family, the relationships between mom, between maybe dad, and the streets. That's where we need the resources, but that's not where the resources go. Institutional confinement is primarily a political and administrative method to avoid the social complexities of delinquent behavior. I don't think I need to explain that. I always like to, I'll conclude here in a minute. I always like to always remind people when I say that this is not new. Things I'm telling you are things that our great-grandparents knew and talked about it, and many times the same language. And I always like to use this one from Homer Folks, who was he was actually leader of the Russell Sage Foundation in the 1890s and a noted social reformer at the time, talking about the congregate youth institutions. And so what are the problems that he identified back in 1891? First, the temptation it presents to parents and guardians to throw off their most sacred responsibilities. The easiest thing in the juvenile justice system to do is throw a kid into an institution. You don't have to deal with it. You get a kid at the local level, you get the kid out of town for a while, it's out of your hair, we're not having to deal with it locally, let the state handle it, is sometimes actually virtually literally what people often say. That was going on back in the 1890s. And institutions, at that time, parents could take their lippy kid down to the local house of refuge or local reform school and sign them over, drop them off. And that was a fate of thousands of youth in the 19th century. And often because of those conflicts, those inevitable conflicts that erupt when kids hit the teenage years. So you could just, you could throw them onto the lap of your local institution. The contaminating influence of association. This is what I've just talked about. When you're hoarding kids from all over the state who have a variety of issues, a variety of problems, varying levels of street sophistication, varying levels of delinquency or criminality, and you throw them all together. Guess what? The kids who are less criminal don't make the more criminal ones better. It's the opposite. I know you all know that. The enduring stigma of having been committed, so a kid, identifies as a delinquent, and sometimes you go back home and it's a, mark of distinction. Renders impossible the study and treatment of each child as an individual. So this is again, 1891. Our, great grandparents were making the same statements back then. Okay, so. Now we are again in a situation where we're attempting to institute reforms at the state level. Our correctional systems are now under the microscope. The governor has promised to fix them, and so what's his solution? And I mentioned the solution earlier. It's about moving the institutions to another administrative body. It's the same institutions with the same staff, with the same culture, and the same kids, frankly, because the kids get caught up in that culture, and they carry that with them. And I hate to say it, but staff training doesn't work very well. When someone's worked at a place and been doing things for 25 years, guess what? They're going to keep doing it. And you can issue all the decrees you want, but if you maintain that same structure, it will go back to operating in the way that people are familiar with, and that's why correctional correctional institutions tend to always fall back on what they were before. So there's that culture, there's that carryover culture, but there's also the structure itself that promotes it. So Governor Newsom is proposing reform. And just to kind of give you an idea, one of the recommendations that were made following the last era of reform, which ended in 2015, when the Farrell lawsuit against the old California Youth Authority came to an end. It was supposed to be fixed then. But a proposal was put forth to create a new type of institution, a more therapeutic institution, a more less prison-like institution, an institution that would really embody the the structure of rehabilitation, be better structured for rehabilitation. So I have two examples, one from 1891 and one from the one that was proposed in 2016. The one on the left, 1890. The one on the right, 2015. I actually think the one in 1890 is nicer, at least the one who did the drawing. But even right down to the squiggly little streets and the fountain in the middle. And so when I say that we tend to repeat the mistakes of the past, we tend to always go back to what we did before. We always go back to what we did before. And this is the warnings we've been giving to the governor, Governor Newsom. Since he came out with this proposal, we applaud, of course, the efforts to improve the state of care within the juvenile justice system, and we need that as an ongoing endeavor. But we need to heed the lessons of history, and we tend not to do that well. On that note, I will open it up to questions, and there is a lot happening. I think I've got 10 minutes left. Please, yes.
Why are the youth committing so many less crimes?
This is the question. I mean, that really is the question, and nobody has come up with an answer. The youth crime rates, I actually teach this in my class over at SF State, and I've always asked my students, and they're starting to convince me that it's video games. I'm not saying that, don't take that. But it was 1994 was the peak year. It was 1994 is an interesting, something happened in 1994. You had violent crime rates peaked. We had a spike in violent crime from 1987 until 1994. There was a spike in violent crime, it was a crack era and all the killings on the streets. And then it hit, and then 1994 hit, and then it went into a precipitous decline, where it has continued on down and kind of plateaued at a very low level, historically low levels. So that was the violent crime. But for me, the most interesting one is what happened to the property crime, because property crime has always been seen as kind of a kid's thing. You know, people in my 60s, I'm not climbing through windows and breaking into houses. And what happened is the property crime had always been at a high threshold. But just like violent crime, in 1994, that also went into a precipitous decline after, far back as records, had always been high, very high. Whatever the cause was, and criminologists have not explained it, have not come up with an answer. All we know is it happened, and youth crime has just fallen off, fallen to unprecedented levels. And that's a good thing. I credit the kids, and I don't know the answer.
I've heard it proposed for adults that the legalization of abortion has contributed to a huge drop in crime.
I've heard that, and that's they backed off of that, partly because the youth poverty rate has remained relatively the same, and so that's the population of kids that it's drawn from. So that's them.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sure.
What kind of models have been developed for decentralization and back in the community, maybe the social structure is just that's never going to happen, but are there some models out there that look at that?
Yes. It's right now it's a struggle between the old systems and new systems. I think we're pretty much at a place where we have an idea of what works. I mean, when you invest in kids, when you invest local levels and families and keeping families together, that's all positive. Politically, it's more of a political issue. Probably the best example was when Jerome Miller closed the reform schools in Massachusetts, which is the first time it happened back in 1971. And this was, we hear about deinstitutionalization in California under Reagan, and the mental health institution was a disaster. It was. In Massachusetts, with the closing of the reform schools, it was quite different. The money from the institutions was actually taken and reinvested in community resources. And they divided the state into 5 regions. They took the money that they were investing in the old reform schools and reinvested it in a network of community-based interventions and services. And it's still one of the most sweeping reforms in juvenile justice history, and it was the subject of a 5-book series by the Harvard Criminal Justice, the Office of Criminal Justice at Harvard University, and it's a 5-book series led by Lloyd Olin, a very prominent sociologist at the time. And it worked pretty well. And I think right now, actually, San Francisco has done a fairly decent job of instituting a network of alternative services. And actually, I didn't get the chance to talk about what's going on here in San Francisco, which is a whole other story, but it's very similar. And it's really a battle between the old system and the new system. We've got a network of nonprofit community agencies operating out in the community, and then you've got the old probation system. And there's competition now. You've got the shrinking kids. And so a lot of the problems that have started over the past year has been that kind of competition that happened and has been happening. But the ingredients here in San Francisco, to create a model kind of community-based system where your services are centered in the community. I mean, we've got, first of all, we're one of the richest cities in the world. We've got the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, which is a unique structure here in San Francisco, which funds these services outside of the traditional juvenile justice system. And so we've been able to create a real network of services. There's plenty more to do, but I think it potentially we present a model which will allow us to, for sure, to close the juvenile hall. I mean, the juvenile hall there's not many kids left in it. There's 30 kids. It's a 150-bed facility. There's just no excuse to keep it open. So.
The General Hospital is asking that we repeat the question because they can't hear the question.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Sorry.
And then
yes.
They also asked if you have an alternative solution to the detention centers.
So, no detention center for one. I mean, the detention centers typically are there for bureaucratic convenience. We institutionalize a lot of kids in the San Francisco Youth Guidance Center needlessly. There was a study done. It was a subject of a news show back about a year ago, and it looked at San Francisco. And there's this thing called a risk assessment instrument, where it's supposed to evaluate each kid that comes in, and it divides kids into high risk, medium risk, and low risk. Kids who are low risk should be automatically released. And there is a mechanism that allows you to override it if you think that sending the kid home might be dangerous. And generally in the field, override rates should never be 5 to 10%. More than 5 to 10%. San Francisco's was 80%. Yes, 80%. And actually some of the neighboring counties weren't doing all that great either. Santa Clara County was about 60%. Alameda County was about the same. Solano County, interesting enough, they were 3%. And they interviewed the chief, and he said, basically, his answer was, they asked him, how are you able to do it and these other counties can't? And his simple answer was, if you've got an instrument, you use it. And they did. And so right now with the kids in the Youth Guidance Center, you've got, we only send about 2 to 3 kids a year to a high security correctional institution. The rest of them all go to some non-secure Most group homes are back home, but we hold them in a high security institution, and it just doesn't make sense. And there's really no justification for it. And for sometimes, you know, some of the issues that these kids have, they don't belong in a detention center. They belong here someplace. Like, yeah, so, yes?
Since it's going to take a while to abolish the juvenile justice system, what are some areas that we as healthcare providers can advocate for in terms of policy change here in California? For example, like what's the upper age limit of juvenile jurisdiction? Like, is there any movement around expunging juvenile records, things like that?
Yeah, so the question is, what can we do in order to improve the functioning of the juvenile justice system as, you know, as practitioners in the field? And one of the things I would urge is that don't get caught up in the rhetoric of the system. Sometimes people, you know, operating on the outside, you might get asked to do an assessment or a diagnosis sometimes. And a lot of times you find even practitioners in the field will adopt the language of the correctional system. Needs a structured environment, which is code word for correctional facility, prison. But I think that the more we advocate for a broader range of interventions based in the community, reinvesting in services in the community that are centered on the kid's daily reality, beginning with the family, the neighborhood, the community, and the constellation of needs that individual kid exhibits. If we can do that, and practitioners in the field, you know, when you prescribe treatment, that's what you do. You look at what the ailment is, and you prescribe based upon that. And I think just actually following that rule, and not get caught up. And I see it in a lot of people. People with PhDs in psychology who, you know, work in the system, they'll end up adopting the, you know, the language of the system and the practices of the system, and they become absorbed in it. Are we over? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.